I will contribute a very interesting topic to old audience who pay attention to the real experience of China's economic growth. And the topic in title is the relinking, the cost of foreign capital dependent industrialization. And China's second cyclical economic crisis since 1952 to 1960. When we give the explanation about the first crisis happened in China, we have indicated the first crisis ended by the Korean War. The Korean War created large demand. I mean, it's a war demand to the domestic industries. That is a very important resources for the industrialization. And because if there is no industrial demand, there will be no industrialization. So the Korean War is a very important for not only China, but also for the East Asian countries' industrial growth. When we talk about the relinking, means that when 1949, China gained the independence by long-term war, long-term fighting, 1,000 people died for the independence. That means China have no foreign capital investments. Almost all of these are joint ventured or foreign capital independent factories or firms, all taken by the governments. And the government set up based on the foreign capital and bureaucratic capital belong to KMT governments, belong to the old governments, taken by the new authority, by the new governments, set up the state capitalism. I mean, the foreign capital investments and the bureaucrats' capital investments, that is the basic economic sector in old China. When it taken by the new authority, they just set up the state capital. State capital can claim into the state capitalism. So originally in the 49, China is an independent economic country, mainly based on the state capital. So at that time, you can say that China is a kind of state capitalist economy. And that is one thing. Another thing that China trying to develop this private capital in name of new democratism, but it's not very succeeded because of the high inflation, because of severe economic crisis happened in 1949 to 1950. And under such kind of heavy pressure of the high inflation, almost all the private investments wouldn't like to stay in physical production, turn to the speculation markets. And that means that almost all of these private sector do their work as a kind of going short. And then to enforce the government's change the policy, to use the government's hands to do going long. And then it's in the summer of 1950, there is a Korean War happened. Korean War taking place and then created large demand, and then to solve the problems of the domestic crisis. That is why I said the Korean War is very important, but that's to China. Another side, we must take a look at the background. After Second World War, there are two mega countries, two very powerful countries emerged from the Second World War. One is United States, another is USSR, Soviet Union. They both control part of the Eurasian continental. But after Second World War, China at that time not very clear to belong to any strategic ally. And United States, after Second World War, succeeded to invest into West Europe. And Soviet Union also succeeded to control the East Europe. That means in the European continent, in Europe, they have made the fixed the barrel between East and West. But in Asia, there still remain the uncertainty of the geopolitics. So that means these two power, two oligarchy imperialist power would like to reform the Asian geopolitics. So the Korean War at that time is a key issue. And when the Korean War taking place in the year 1950, in June 10th, and United States started to rearm Japan. Originally, after Second World War in 1945, Japan is unarmed, and even not only no soldiers, no army, even the police station have no gun, no nothing. They just have a stake, wooden stake. So at that time, Japanese is thoroughly unarmed. But caused by the Korean War, United States need to rearm Japan. Not only give the military facilities, but also invest into the military highway industries. So the total amount since Korean War, United States invest into Japan is almost $15 billion. At that time, it's big money. And so Japan regenerate the industries very fast. So since the beginning of 1950, so just 10 years, in 1960s, Japan regenerate the industries based on the heavy industry and the military industry. So that is a kind of very important phenomena to understand what is the East Asian geopolitics, also caused by the Korean War. And China have a deal with Soviet Union. And Soviet Union start, and because China joined the Korean War, cannot use the rifle with millet. It's because they have to facing the 16 countries, organize the UN troops. This UN troops is a very modern facilities. So this peasants' revolution in China, mainly by mobilize the peasants, join the guerrillas army, and also they're in front of the KMT army. Also, the army men, these soldiers, mainly are peasants. So you can directly use the land revolution as a kind of propaganda to mobilize the KMT government's army, the soldiers give up the weapon, come to the PLA, People's Liberation Army. So that is the political propaganda in the domestic fighting, in the land revolution, is very workable, very effective. But if this army going out of the country, join the Korean War, when they're facing these UN troops, they are foreigners. They don't have the same interest as a PLA. Means that you cannot mobilize these soldiers to join the land revolution. They cannot give up the weapon. So you have to facing very hard fighting to fight these modern armed troops. So that means that the Chinese army in Korean War need to re-facilitated by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gave the weapons, tank and air force and whatever is a machine gun and big gun, whatever. These rearmed the Chinese army in the Korean War 2 times until the whole of these army men all have the Soviet Union facilities joined as the Korean War. That is very important, and also because of the army rearmed, so they need large amount of the factories for produce and prepare or repair these weapons. So that is means from the 1950s, Soviet Union started to invest into China for build up these military industries. So that is almost the same time. United States invest into Japan for Korean War, means that Japan got large foreign investments, foreign capital investments for regenerated industrialization. And at that time, mainland China also have the chance to take the investments. It's not exactly the money. They just move, they transfer the whole of the factories, the workshops, the machines directly into China. So that is more easier to have the industries, to have the factory. It doesn't mean that you need to learn how to start your industries. It means that you duplicate, you directly take these factories. So that is very interesting, because that if you have you set up your new authority, but these authorities, the officials organized by the guerrilla men, more than 70% illiterates. They cannot read. They do read something, but it's quite simple. Means that they have no such kind of modern knowledge, mathematics and philosophies and techniques, whatever. They don't have. It means that they cannot use these officials from the guerrilla movements directly going to the factories to manage. And they also have no engineer, no technicians, and even no skillful workers. So that is a very different. So in Japan, originally Japan has been industrialized. They have enough skillful workers, engineers, managers, whatever, and also the government officials was very familiar with how to run the industries. But in mainland China, you are a peasant country, you are guerrilla movements to take the authorities, and you are new governments, but you have no ability to not only run the factory, even working inside the factory. So that is difference. So Japan is very fast, and then to rebuild up the industries. And then from 1960s, Japan became a kind of export country, exports a lot, until 1970s, changed the structure. So that is one case. But the cost of Japan is that, but it's not the industrialized cost. It means that when they failed of the Second World War, they have been totally occupied by U.S. Army. So they have lost their sovereignty. Until now, Japan, the cost means that from Second World War, Japan is not exactly authority controlled by themselves. So they must keep the relation, full relation with the United States. That is their institutional cost. But in China, when this country is a big continental country with the biggest population size, when they took this foreign capital, not foreign capital, but foreign factory. This foreign factory only can be managed by foreigner. So at that time, Soviet Union not only sent the military advisory group to help the management of the army, even the command headquarters of the war in Korea, but also need to give a lot of trainings to these army officers in China. And also Soviet Union need to send the factory manager. You said nowadays CEO, whatever. The factory managers and engineers and technicians and skillful workers. Means that almost the whole of factory cannot have the Chinese worker, Chinese manager. So this is quite a complicated situation. And then based on such kind of Soviet Union managed factories, what is the government? Do you think that you can have a local governments to directly manage these factories? No way. And central governments, every division, there is an advisor from Soviet Union. Every departments of the governments also have a group, an advisory group from Soviet Union, and also the ministries. And then the China side need to pay very high cost as a salary, because Soviet Union side, they need double salary. Because they said, okay, I sent one manager to your country to help you. I need to retrain another one. So I need double salary. For one give it to you, another give to my people. I need to retrain to be a factory manager or engineer. So I need double cost. So that means one factory manager in China, Chinese need to pay the salary as the chairman. I mean, Mao's salary. Okay. So, and if they hire one so-called engineer, they need to pay the minister's salary. And then if they use a technician, they need to pay the department level's salary. And then if they use one worker from Soviet Union, they need to pay the division chief salary. So that is what is that? You can think about what is that. Do you think that you still have independent at that time? Mm-hmm. If you cannot have your own manager, your own engineer, your own technician, your own worker, it means that economically you have lost your independence. So that is why at the title of this lecture, I said relinking. Originally in 1949, caused by 100 years fightings, you gained the independence. But nowadays, not nowadays, at that time, from the 1950, caused by the Korean War, any Chinese politician, I mean political leader, aware, very clear, if they keep going to do this, they will have no independence. Because at that time, after Second World War, China is not Japan. Japan is failed, lost the sovereignty. But China gained the sovereignty. So that means it's quite different. Can China, caused by relinking with Soviet Union in investments, I mean, not investment, move the factory into China? I mean, basically, economically, they have a very big risk of losing the sovereignty. That is the challenge. So I said that the uncertainty, it's the background. We must know the geopolitics after the Second World War. And also that time, it's a Cold War. Ideology control almost all the media and the government's propagandas. So at that time, because China need to fight UN troops, so certainly in the world, media, society, world propaganda, all close to the Cold War propaganda ideologies. So China is politically incorrect. So since that time, since the 1950, China got to facing the very challengeable political situation with political incorrect. And the United States and other UN troops, up to now, they still maintain their political correct. That is why nowadays most of these overseas scholar society or media society and whatever, they cannot do right studies on 1950s in China because China at that time has been entitled as political incorrect. Whatever you do as an effort, no right, no good. So let me give the detailed explanation about what Chinese did in 1950s. So that is our basic situation about the Second World War geopolitics. Now the most important thing I mentioned that is you control your authority, your sovereignty or not. You maintain the dependence or not. That is one thing that's caused by the geopolitics. But inside, we also have an internal contradiction. You know that China gained the independence because caused by the land revolution. And then after land revolution, what is the basic situation? After land revolution, you have almost only 10% live in the urban area. Only 5% population involved of the industries. And means more than 95% of the population have nothing relation with the industries. And more than 88% of population scattered as a household farming system. Means that less than 0.2 hectare per capita labor per capita. And so that means you have a no skilling farm. You have a no contribution from agriculture to the industrializations. And then the city, the industries, combining the city governments, very difficult to take surplus from the countryside. That is also so outside, external, the contradiction is very clear. Independence or not. And then the internal contradiction also very clear because almost all the industries have an internal mechanism that is capital intensive and then less labor. But China is a big labor resources, less capital. At that time, even zero capital. So how can China maintain the heavy industry, military industry, come from Soviet Union, not domestic? Means that you have a kind of industry fly from out from outside, and then land in your country. You need to maintain because it's a heavy industry. It's very important events. Almost all the developing countries need to pay attention to such kind of important events. Only this time, only caused by Second World War later geopolitics, the leading country invest in outside country with heavy industry and military industry. After that, since 1960s, 1970s, when the second transfer the industries outside, that's only light industry or manufacturing industry. No heavy industry, no machinery industry, no chemical industry, no military industries. So only this time, 1950s, caused by the geopolitical confrontation. China and East Europe got the machinery industry, heavy industry, military industry, chemical industry. These are basic industries from Soviet Union. And then American invest to West Europe and Japan also with heavy industry, machinery industry, chemical industry, and so and so. That means the basic industry only got in 1950. So that is also very important that most of these developing countries, even they got some investments from foreign capital, but this foreign capital cannot set up any industrial route inside. So it's a rootless industries, easier to move out. Like the coastal China since 1980s got so many rootless industries. Now, one by another, move to Vietnam, Cambodia, or Bangladesh, and India. It's a light industry. It's manufacturing industries. Cannot be very strong related with the heavy industry. So when you said that you want to be an industrialized country, you must set up a kind of perfect structural industries from the resources industry and the iron industry, steel industry, and the machinery industry, and then the manufacturing. You have a systematic industrial system. That means that you finish industrialization. But if you haven't, you only have a manufacturing, like Thailand or Philippines or Indonesia or even you can say Chinese Taiwan or something. And they all have no heavy industries, no machinery industries, so they only can produce some commercial goods. That doesn't mean they have set up industries. Understand me? It's quite important events. So we should first page understand that is very important. And we also need to know there are a kind of economic regulation. Why this leading country would like to transfer out their industries to other countries? Because here, that is a physical production in United States since 1950s, after the Second World War. You should or you must understand Second World War caused by the big crisis happened in capitalist world, in West countries, including of United States, in 1929 to 1930s. Then, because they cannot solve the problem of overproduction, when Western countries set up their industries, set up the mass production, very soon they got to facing the challenge of overproduction. Overproduction is the big crisis. Happened in late 1920s to 1930s. And then the capitalist country cannot solve the problem by so-called market system, by liberalism system. So they all fall into the Second World War. And caused by Second World War, because American at that time very far from the European battlefield. So American can still maintain very high industrial production. So, but after Second World War, there's no demand from the Second World War. So American have very clear to show their industries declines. The profit of the physical industrial production declined. And then other countries, look at the rest of the world, other countries, because they got the transferring industries. So, and also the price of the productivity in other world very low. So they have such kind of growth. Their profits grow up. Until the 1990s, there's a cross, means that the physical production profit mainly taken by the other world. not by United States. So United States got very high growth, industry growth in the Second World War or after Second World War by Marshall Project to rearm Europe and Japan. So, but after 1950s, downgrade gradually. So that is another background, means that the capitalist industrialization have a kind of internal regulation economically. So if they cannot occupy other country or other world, that means that there will no way out. One way is fighting, is the war. Another way is transfer out your industries. So that's one also means a very, very interesting phenomena that after the Second World War, almost all the countries, all the politicians worry about the Third World War. They all think that there will be the Third World War. That is why they gave a propaganda. They say that we need to strengthen our power. We need to set up a line. We need to have a kind of liberalist countries, organizations, and to fight another side. Another side is a dedicated system and a totalitarian system, whatever. So that is a Cold War ideology. But it's very, very easy to make people believe. Why that? Because all people think that there will be the Third World War. They all passed the Second World War. It's destroyed almost 100 billion people's life. So that time, okay, they think that there will be maybe tomorrow, maybe next month, maybe next year. But is there any people taking into consideration why the Third World War you worry about more than decades not happened? Where is the Third World War? Why? It's vanished. Because transferring out their big surplus industrial capacity out to other countries, transfer to other countries. So think about the First World War and the Second World War, all happened in the capitalist world, in Europe. Why? Because these countries inside of capitalist system could hardly solve the internal contradiction. That is overproduction. Overproduction comes from the gap between poor and the rich. Poor became more poor, cannot buy the products. Rich became more rich. They don't need to buy more products. So you have a mass production, but you have a little consumption. So that is why the mass production of the industrialization turned to the overproduction. That's because of the gap enlarged. So that is a capitalist problem. You cannot solve the capitalist problem by the capitalist world. That means that Albert Einstein said, you cannot solve the problem with the thinking way of making the problem. So the capitalism making the problem cannot solve the problem by capitalism itself. So nowadays, the Third World War vanished because of these industries moved to the Third World countries, moved to developing countries. And then developing countries, they have a different system, like China. What is the Chinese system? Nowadays, they have so many arguments outside of China, but nobody can be very clear to give you a concept. What is the Chinese system? Capitalism? Or statism? Or whatever. And also, when China gained the industrialization, China still have a large amount of population living in countryside. They said it's a backward? No, they may have a more enjoyable of their organic food and ecological environment, whatever. So they said, okay, you need to upgrade your industrial structure. Maybe, may not be, because that the heavy industry still be here. inside, and the resources industries, and the steel industries, iron industries, machinery industry, whatever. If you just upgrade to the financial industry, means that it's bubble economy. So China cannot directly duplicate the UK system, United States system, whatever, because it's all upgrade to the financial sector, created GDP 80%, or United States the highest 87%. So China still maintain from the basic, from the agriculture, from the resources, from the basic industries, heavy industry, until now the full structure. Means that this is a three-dimensional, four-dimensional, or whatever. It's a multi-dimensional economic structure nowadays still be in China. So they may avoid a lot of critical trouble, like West styles capitalist system. So when we talk about this one, we said it's not only the economic regulation, means that this one make very important influence to the First and Second World War. This one also turned to the Third World War. But because of they not only transfer out the cost, but also transfer out the physical production facilities to the developing countries. So that is quite important. And also we should take into the consideration that just caused by Second World War, caused by this imperialist country released control of their colonized area. So there are hundreds of the new country emerged, became an independent country. That is a big change. That is also why there's no Third World War, because almost all of these new emerged developing country, they set up their own sovereignties. They all need to have the facilities. They all need to learn from the Western countries' industrializations. They all need to develop their local natural resources for their local needs. So it means that they built up a lot of local economy by the local industries. So that means that after Second World War, automatically or naturally, caused by more than 100 new independent countries taking place, so enlarged the industrial markets. So more countries want to have industrialization. So means that there's the markets in the world larger and larger. Not only solved a part of the problem of capitalist system, but also solved large amount of the problems of independent authorities themselves. So let's go to another page. It's also, we need to pay attention to the mainstream ideologies regulation. They believe that the regulation means that the poor countries all are agriculture country. So the agriculture could hardly create GDP. So but these are agriculture-based countries are the poor country, and urbanized countries are so-called the rich country. So it means that a lot of developing countries, no matter it's a left wing or right wing, all believe that they need to upgrade their economy from the agriculture into the industrialization, from the rural society to the urban society. So this a kind of regulation make almost all developing countries, when they gain their independence, the mainstream in these developing countries all have the ideology, belief they have to set up the modernization. Modernization means industrialization and urbanization. So that is why they all turn to the developed country, want to have the capital investments to set up their own economy. So that is a also very interesting phenomenon. But most of these developing countries, they have their constraints. like China, large amount of the terrain, the desert, high plateau mountain areas, only very little terrain plain, very little plain, mainly at the coastal area. So in China, you can see that, and only 1/8 terrain area at the coastal area, but these areas hustled big cities, mega cities. So that means that the industries and agricultures, they compete to take the land. The urban and the rural also compete, join the competition to take the land. And also the land need not only land, but also the water and the sunshine. The water, sunshine, and land can contribute to food, but also have to facilitate the cities. So that is a so-called dual system in China. The large number of the population live in the countryside, just a little live in the urban area. That is applied to geo resources. So, but when you want to change, you want to have a large number of people live in the urban area. So you must know that the urban people, their life, urban life, need consume more water resources, 27 times than a human being, than a person in countryside. You live in big cities. You have a morning shower and evening bath and whatever, and you use a lot of waters. But in the countryside, before they built up the pipe water, they use the wells to, especially in mountain area. You know that 70% of Chinese territory is mountain areas and desert areas and high plateau areas. It's more difficult to take the water. So they save water. The agriculture is a water savings agriculture. So it means that these, if you set up the industries, you make people hustled in cities, you need to consume too much water. But China is very short of the water. And only, you know that the water resources in China only 1/6 of the world average. The land is 1/7 of the world average. So it means that if you think that it's a big population country, there are quite constraints. The quite important constraints is basic resources, water and the land. And then let's go to see that the mine. So you can see that these rich 8 countries, they have more than 60% of the mine. And then China only have 12. China have 20% of the population of the world, only have 12% of the mine resources of the world. So it means that if you want to set up the industries, you need to import a lot of mine resources. So even catch to the world average, you need to import at least 8%, means almost half. So if you contribute a lot to the world markets, means that you need to consume more than 20%. Nowadays, China is the biggest export country. Import a lot raw materials, mine resources. That is caused by the industrialization. And it's a basic situation. But what is the main resources in China? Here. The labor population in China is almost 63.5%. And the women, female, joined the labor markets. The female worked. It's 86%, highest in the world. You must know that is the outcome of the land revolution. So the Communist Party sent a lot of team, as a propaganda team, down to the village to mobilize the women, join the trainings, and then to organize the women, join the constructions. So the Chinese female labor now join the labor markets much higher than any other countries in the world. So that means that China have a large number of the labor resources. So the labor resources is somehow oversupply. Only agricultural society can be the labor pool to maintain such kind of big labor resources. So if you make them, all of these laborers going to the markets, that will be the disaster. Because you cannot create any industries to absorb so big labor resources. So that is a very interesting phenomena also need to pay attention to. So when we have this background, the basic situation, we need to do some analysis. You can see that the economic infrastructure in almost all of these developing countries cannot have enough surplus to maintain the political superstructure if you duplicate the political superstructure and ideologies from Western society. That is a basic contradiction in almost all of these developing countries. But almost all of these developing countries, when they set up their authorities, they all duplicate the Western super political structure. I mean, political superstructure not from their own, not from local. Even they originally a tribe society, indigenous population, they all take the Western style political superstructure. But it's very high institutional cost. You have a parliamentary, you have a high class, and you have high education, you have a free media, you have a modernized police system, you have a modernized army, whatever you have, all need big budget. So that means almost large number of the newly independent countries have the subsidies from their colonial master countries originally, subsidize their political superstructure. Only pay for the political, maintain your colonial master country in the capital city, and then out of the capital city, nothing. So that is a very important contradiction inside almost all the developing countries. Traditional agriculture, economic infrastructure cannot have the surplus contribute to the political superstructure. That is a Marxist theory. I have many times discussion with Sami Amin about such kind of contradiction. How these developing countries' social movements aware that is the key issue. So if you cannot set up, if you cannot change your infrastructure economically, you cannot just maintain such kind of, in name of liberalism, whatever, left liberalism or right-wing liberalism, whatever. That is from Europe, from Europe-centric, from colonial master countries. It's not your system. If you build up such kind of system politically, you must fall into the contradiction because no resources, no surplus from your economy. So if you do your studies in these developing countries, you also need to know that almost all of these movements, these societies, these movements nowadays politicized by Eurocentric philosophy, Eurocentric ideologies, not by the local situation. None of social movements exactly back to the local situation. So that is why these years we paid a lot of time to do the studies in these developing countries, want to know what is a local credit, what is a community currency, what is localization, and how these local people do even tiny efforts to develop local. If there's no efforts, turn back to their local development, to mobilize local people join the local development. Whatever the slogans, even it's more beautiful slogans, shining, it's useless. So that is a quite important factor we need to take into the consideration. Okay, so that is army originally from Egypt. That is Egypt. So politicized the women movements, joined the campaign of election. That is even you join the campaign of election, and who will win the election? It's politicians. And all these politicians need to claim the political structure similar as the Western-centric. So that is a kind of tragedy system, or tragedy, it's a drama of these developing countries. The more you mobilize people join the political movements in the capital cities, the less the power going down to the local, the less the efforts going down to the local. And then when these very shining politicians took the power, they need to negotiate with these Western powers and then trade out your authorities, your sovereignties. Natural resources need to be controlled by the transnational company, and then they give you subsidies to maintain your political power. That is the drama. That is this very sadness of almost all of these developing countries' social movements. You mobilize not large number of people join the movements in name of any isms, but indeed you lost the economic sovereignty. That is a very important event we need to take into our consideration. Okay, so next. When we said the China's industrialization, why China have a very big crisis in 1950s? It's because of the land revolution. After the land revolution, they gave the land to the peasants, set up the agricultural society as a stability. Agricultural society is very stability, but based on that, you cannot set up the local industries because no surplus. Even they have a little surplus, not easy to take because they scattered. So here, we shows that before the land revolution and before 1950s, the land distribution, the land ownership, distribute in full class in the countryside. It's almost even. That is landlord. That is kulak, rich farmers. That is middle farmers. That is poor farmers. They occupy the land. Poor farmers less, but not very short as the landlord. But the population, this is the population. Because the landlord population is very small. Poor farmers' population is big. So the population per capita is poor farmers very less, and rich people they have more. So, but more is just 2 hectares. Less than 2 hectares. Understand me? Even before the land revolution, the landlord per capita land ownership just less than 2 hectares. So the family may be 10 hectares or 15 hectares. So in China, you cannot find many big landlord, big farm. The landlord in the countryside, especially in its natural village, many village, even no landlord, because the land resources is quite limited, and the rural population enlarged, so no easy to set up big farm. That is before land revolution. So the land revolution is one principle in the land revolution. That's equal distribute all land. No matter you are clerk or middle farmer, you also need to give up some land to the poor. So finally, when they finish the land reform, look, that is a land reform finish. And the land distribution is very even. And look at this, per capita. The landlord per capita is less than 2 hectares. And nowadays, when they have when they finish the land revolution, the landlord only have less than 0.2 hectares, means that 10 times decreased. But the poor peasants, and also the same, less than 0.2 hectares. So means that equal. So the equal distribute the land to every household means that the rich farmer or middle farmer, they can produce more grain, more products, means that they have a high productivity, but they have a same size of the land. And the poor farmer originally have no such kind of high productivity. This words is politically incorrect, but it's truth. When I was educated youth in the village, and most of our village members wouldn't like to elect the poor farmer to be the production team leader, because we would like to select the rich farmer or middle farmer to be the team leader, because they have more productivity. They can lead the whole of the team to have a more yield annually. So if you, politically, you are correct, you select poor farmer to be the team leader, and then the whole of the annual yield, you cannot compete with other team. So that is the truth. So it means if you give the equal size of the land, means that the agricultural productivity may not be benefits by such kind of land system. Even the whole of the productions, whole of the products, agriculture grow up. But if you just take the studies, you may know that the highest productivity in agricultural production is contributed by the kulak and the middle farm. The landlord take the revenue. They don't do the work. But when they take almost large part of the agricultural surplus, they became the dealer. The landlord play important role in the old society in agriculture, means that they can do wholesale. Free means cost free. They don't need to pay any cost, because all of these farmers leasing the land from landlord, they naturally to contribute the surplus to the landlord. They don't need the landlord go to take. Why? Because they want to next year still lease land from landlord. So it means the landlord have even no institutional cost, transitional cost to take the surplus from the agriculture, from the households. And then landlord can be the wholesale dealer. And then you can have a scale of the agricultural surplus supply to the cities. So long-termly, the grain price could hardly be increased because they have enough supply from the countryside. That is a difference. So when you finish your land reform, you will find it's very difficult to take surplus from the countryside. So that is why in the beginning of 1950s, when they set up the Soviet Union invested foreign capital factories in mainland China, when they have a lot of people join the construction in the industrialization, they need more supply from the countryside. They feel first difficult, that is households by households, to take the surplus. One maybe have a 50 kilo, another maybe have a 80 kilo. It's quite small. And then you need to pay a lot of transition cost. So that is why they reorganize, the governments reorganize the peasants as cooperatives, trying to reduce the institutional cost. And another side, government set up the 供销社, it's how to say that, it's monopoly control the agricultural markets in name of 供销社. In name of the market buying and selling market cooperatives, but controlled by the governments. And the older staff paid the salary by the governments, and then mainly for controlling all the surplus from the countryside. So one hand, they reorganize the peasants as a kind of organization. Another side, they set up a kind of 供销社 as a monopoly control the old surplus from the agriculture. All of these two hands only for the main body, that is industrialization. So when we have such kind of problem, we need to know the key point of the 1950s institutional change. The institutional reform caused by the, that is sovereignty externalities. Almost all of the developing countries, when they gain their independence, they need to have the deal, they need to have a trade with colonial master countries. So almost key issue of the economic sectors all controlled by the master countries, not by the independent authority themselves, like bank system. Almost all the African banks in African countries, not African authority control and foreign capital control. And the natural resources control also. Most of these African countries, when they gain the independence, they got to trade out their natural resources controlled by transnational companies. So even these public sectors, like electricity, like water system, water supply, and so, many controlled by these transnational company, come from the master countries in the colonizations. So that is a big problem for these countries. They only can nominally gain the independence politically, but they cannot gain the independence in economic sectors. So, but they also want to have industrialization, because industrialization is very important contents of the modernization. So modernization is an aim for almost all of these developing countries. But modernization created by Europe, by United States, by these Western countries, has been packaged by the so-called Western-centric ideology. So that these are two major factors joined together to constrain developing countries going forward. And then we also need to know that when they want to set up the urbanization, the industrialization, only one resources is from countryside, from agriculture. So the more agricultural land, water, and labor occupied by the urban, by the industries, means that the urban became more poor. Rural became more poor, and the urban became more rich. But urban controlled by the transnational company. So urban take a large amount of the outside risks. So in the urban, the more you develop your urban industries, the more risks created, and then turn to the crisis. And then the crisis make big cost also transfer to the countryside, to the rural society. So that is why rural became more poor. And even they do have some industries, they have very oftenly to deal with the industrial crisis. So when the whole of this marginalized society could hardly to stand such kind of outside cost transfer to them, they only can transfer this cost into the environment, into the nature. So this world became worse and worse, caused by such kind of contradictions. Now let's go back to how China set up their industries in 1950s. We can see that it's just now I mentioned this old China's industrialization the surplus come from the countryside. There's the landlord. They take the surplus by these poor farmers and the rich middle farmers. They contribute their surplus automatically to the landlord, and landlord can do the wholesale in the urban. And then also landlord can take a surplus to turn the landlord into the businessman, to set up the workshop and the stores, whatever. So that is why in 1930s, the Chinese domestic industrialization grew up very fast. The economic also grew up very fast. Last time I talked about 1930s, is that 80.4% annual growth. It's a high growth in the world at that time in 1930s. But in 1930s, in Western countries, it's falling into the crisis. So in China, it's a high growth, but just a bad impact from the Western countries' economic crisis, China falling into the financial crisis. That is last time. When we talk about the first crisis, we have given the roughly explanation about the 1930s. But 1950s, I said reorganize the peasants as a collective. First, it's a cooperative. Second, it's collective. Means that they can fully mobilize the surplus labor, very low cost, to join the construction. So the new China's accumulation is quite different with the old China's accumulation. So old China accumulation, you can say that it's a market system. New China's accumulation is a kind of planning system or whatever. But it's a collective system. By the collective system, you can use your big labor resources. You must know that if you use one labor, one family, you only can have a workshop. If you concentrate large number of labor force, you can replace the capital because you are short of the capital. So most of these developing countries could hardly to concentrate labor resources, invest into the construction because they are short of the ability to reorganize the rural society. China, in the history, the rural society well organized by the family clan or by some kind of education or by maybe the religion. But anyway, that's originally because that the agriculture need to have irrigation, need to have labor to do the irrigation constructions, or they need to deal with some problem of the flood to build up the dam, or they need a lot of things. It means that a lot of collective work. So the in the new China, you name the system into collective. But in traditional China, in the history, people mobilized to organize together to join some construction public. That is very popular in thousands of years. So that means in the new China, they just concentrate the labor into the industrial construction. That is different with another historical period. We can see that caused by a collective system, the Chinese 1950s primitive accumulation of industrialization more fast than any others. These are the women mobilized to join the team to contribute their labor resources as a team, not individual. And then you can see that this is in the western, southwest China, mountain area, very difficult to build up the railway, but finish in 1952. That is from Chengdu to Chongqing. All in the mountain areas, they need to have many very difficult construction, mainly by the people drawing this one, but also facilitated by the urban industries. Here is from the 1955, they have set up the factory to produce the tracks. But the first track manufactured, I mean the component from Soviet Union, that is in 1954. And here is the big tractor. This tractor. This tractor can be tank. Means that the upper one is for tractor, but you turn this one. Because the whole of the machines, the components, can be utilized into the tank. So it means that it's not only for the common use, but also for the military. So you can see these pictures to show that in the 1950s, the Soviet Union styles, heavy industries, machinery industries, military industries, all succeeded in mainland China. And mainly caused by you can take the surplus from the agriculture by collective system. So no matter you name this system in socialism or state capitalism or laborist capitalism, whatever, that's just ideology. Or maybe it's a theoretical needs, but we just talk about the truth, talk about the reality. What happened? Collective facilitates the industrialization in the urban areas. So that is our basic phenomena. I suppose that the audience should pay attention to these pictures. They logically shows that how China take the surplus for the primitive accumulation of the industrial capital. Originally, it's exactly agriculture country. Based on the agriculture country, how that you set up the industries, that is very important. Certainly the foreign capital from Soviet Union is also very important. So how to evaluate, how to give the comments of the collective system. Just now, this one, we give this only one pictures. But in the collective system, it's extremely difficult when you want to set up a collective system. So when we go to next page, we must show that the collective system not mainly for the agriculture, not for the rural society. It's mainly for the industrialization. Means that the collective system do have a large amount of institutional returns, but not taken by the agriculture, not taken by the peasants. It's taken by the state capitalists. By state capitalists means that the governments take the surplus, reinvest into the. So that time we can say governments is corporation. Government is not exactly government. Government is corporation. Government is form. Governments take surplus, reinvest into the industrialization. So China set up the primitive corporation. That is a system. And that is macro. When we talk about the micro, we can see that the local can use large number of the agriculture, large number of labor resources into the infrastructure construction, into the countryside, into the agriculture. So originally China only have the irrigated land less than 20%. After collective system, go up to almost 50%. Not only double and half. Irrigated land can have a 70% increment of the agricultural yield. Think about how China solved the hunger issue by use the collective system to make the surplus labor join the construction of the infrastructure in agriculture. Meanwhile, if you have a large agricultural infrastructure construction, you need more facilities. You need tractor, and you need a lot of trucks, you need a lot of facilities. So means that open the agricultural markets for the industries in the cities. So all of these things, these high price industrial products come to the agriculture. You also need to pay back by the low price agricultural products. So it means the sizes. The price system take a lot of rural surplus into the city industries by the price difference. So means that they not only have a macro effective, but also have a macro affections. So, but all of these things to make the cost means that you low price, you pay the high price industrial products, you give the low price agricultural products to the cities, and then you take the cost. This cost turn to the poor. So finally, when China, the governments have set up the perfect structure industries, almost all the agricultural society became poor. That is the poverty, the root reason of the poverty in rural China. Not because of agriculture itself, very low or very bad. No, originally it's good. Caused by agriculture contribute too much and then take too much cost. Contribute too much taken by cities and take too much cost also given by the cities. So rural society became, the whole of the rural society became poor. That is the gap of rural and urban. Rural and urban gap, also the poor and rich gap, also the modernized and backward gap, whatever is happening in the countryside. Okay, also because of the, it's similar. Any developing countries, if you take the foreign capital for your own industries, it's immediately turn to the debts. Your debts need to pay back because it's a very hard burden. They wouldn't like to give you any priority. You must pay back. But when 1950, mainland China take the Soviet Union's facilities, you don't need to pay back immediately because it's a Korean War. So they have a geostrategic relation. Strategic relation means that you don't need to pay back at that time, but later. So these 5 years is smoothly from 1950s to 1955. China got large number of these facilities, built up a lot of factories. So the economic growth very high. This is economic investments goes very high from 1950s. And then down from 1955, because what happened here? What real happened? Because from 1954, China built up, from 52, China taken the Northeast China government style into the central. Because originally, Soviet Union invested mainly in Northeast. So Northeast governments is exactly Soviet Union style. And then from 1952, the Northeast government style moved to Beijing, to the central style. So I mentioned that at that time, almost all the central government's division have a Soviet Union advisor. Almost all the university, every department of university, you have a Soviet Union teachers. Tell you how to translate the Soviet Union textbook, turn to Chinese. And then you teach your students, you train your cadres all in Soviet Union ideology and their textbooks, their series, whatever. It's a typical Soviet Union. And then your government system all duplicated from Soviet Union. Your army duplicated from Soviet Union. Everything you copy. So these are faster, very fast. Just 2 years, since 1952, Northeast China's governments is a Soviet Union style, turned to the central. And large number of the Soviet Union sent their cadres, their teachers, and their technicians come to China and almost control all of these, the governments and the university, the institute and the factories, whatever. So that time can be summarized as 全盘苏化. How to translate means that whole of the system, Soviet Union styles, or Soviet Unionized, or SSSRized Chinese system, economically and politically. That is relinking. I mean, you're totally controlled by the foreign capital. This foreign capital, indeed, essentially, is a state capitalism. Understand me? State capitalism is exactly Stalinism. Lenin raised up this concept. State capitalism can be a part of the socialism. When you build up the state capitalism, it's that for mass production. When you realize the mass production, you need to change state capitalism into socialism. That originally Lenin raised up such kind of theory. But when Lenin gave this power to Stalin, Stalin realized state capitalism, but not realized the socialism. So Stalin became a kind of individual power, means unipower. And so he is more easy to mobilize the whole resources for the state capitalism. So when Stalin gave this Soviet Union styles basic economy, that is industrialization, into China, the management system, the government system, the education system, training system, science system, whatever, all need to take from Soviet Union. So that time, we can say that it's a Soviet Unionized Chinese system, whole of the system. And then that turned to the inside or internal contradiction. First, that is come from Mao himself. Mao at that time is a top one leader. He organized a closed-door meeting to make all the ministers join this closed-door meeting at the end of 1954. The topic is what? He said, should we give up our authority, our sovereignty? He said, we have fight more than 100 years, many generations, millions of people died. Finally, we gained the sovereignty. But nowadays, it seems that we are going to give up. Understand? I suppose any people easy to understand what he talked. But most of his ministers cannot give an answer. Because all of this, even the military system, Soviet Union sent the advisory group to help you to use these modernized weapons. Yes, you set up your own air force, but your air force trained by Soviet Union. You set up your communications systems in the army, but it also need to have the advice from Soviet Union. So many modernized sectors in the army, in the education, in the science studies, everything you need to facilitate from outside, from Soviet Union. You cannot give up. You cannot stop. So if you want to take such kind of support, such kind of facilities, you need to follow. So almost all of these ministers could hardly immediately give an answer. So finally, when they have more than 1 month's discussions, they have no conclusion. Not easy to say that, okay, we want to maintain our independence, and then we refuse. No. You cannot refuse. You need to follow the capital, because you have no capital. The industrialization is a capital-intensive procedure. Industrial means capital-intensive. You need to have more capital, more technical, more science. You need to have many things from your foreign leading country. So they said, okay, politically, in name of Chinese Communist Party, we need to be independent. So from 1955, Chinese tried to perform as an independent political power, political organization. That is a party. So the party, the first is a party raised up the arguments with Hungarian accent. When Hungarian happened political movements, Soviet Union pressed Hungarian movements, and Chinese political party raised up the arguments, said we disagree with your behavior. As an independent political party, Soviet Union Communist Party cannot use the measure to deal with the contradiction with brother's party. They are not your son, they are your brother. That is the first. Chinese Communist Party raised up the arguments to Soviet Union politically. Others, they still need you facilitate, but politically they raised up the difference. So that is what happened in 1955. Why that this somehow they going down? It's because that they have an argument. And then from 55 to 56, 57, the arguments more and more created. That is from nowadays a lot of historians, they do the studies based on the Soviet Union's materials, because Soviet Union collapsed and then they released control. Their materials, their documents, all can be very open to read. But in China, Chinese Communist Party still be there, not collapse. So they control their documents. You cannot read any documents from China side. You only read Soviet Union documents. And Soviet Union documents gave very serious comments to Chinese Communist Party in the 1950s. They said, okay, you want to be the leader. You disagree with our Soviet Union. We are the whole of the communist world. Soviet Union is the leader. You are just a follower. You could hardly challenge the leader's decision. So there are so many bad comments to China, and also gave bad comments to Mao, said you are only a local leader. You need to follow the central leader, but you want to be the central, so you want to set up another center. So they have so many bad comments to Mao. All of these documents now taken by these Western historians. They said, okay, 1950s, you Chinese political leaders, you want to do something, but all not from China. That is a bias in 1950s. And also, from the 1957, when Chinese finished the first 5-year plan, the first 5-year plan is exactly created by the Soviet Union. And when they want to start the second 5-year plan, Soviet Union said, okay, we need to change the facility way. We gave you aid. We still help you, but must be as a trade. Originally, it's a strategic aid, now became trade. And the trade, controlled by Soviet Union system, it's a barter system, very low price of the agricultural products. But the Soviet Union only want to give them the agricultural products and mine products, means that low price. And they give you the facilities, machines, it's high price, 3 times. That is a very interesting trade. You can think that's unfair, but you must follow. So from the 1970s, 1957, China got very low, 57, that's the investment slow. And also from that time, the surplus of the budget goes down, under 0. But when the Soviet Union reduced the facilities, and we give you a high price, so China got to turn to what? To local. Originally, all the strategic aid taken by the central, but when they have the trade, okay, Chinese central have no ability to keep going of such kind of high-cost industries. So they're trying to mobilize local. So local have a large number of the investments, and so that is a physical investments. Local increased. You can look at this one. The central budget downgrade faster from the 1957. And the local budget up very faster, up to more than less than 80%, and the central 20%. So this one to show that from 1957 there is a kind of potential crisis caused by your foreign capital changed. So any developing country, if you just think about the crisis happening inside, no, you need to pay attention to the outside. The outside factor always play important role. So that's one also caused by the change of Soviet Union aid. The budget structure changed. And then the local going to have a lot of big effort. That is a so-called Great Leap. And this one is that local want to build up the steel factory, but it's a very, very low quality. And this one is from 1958. In southern Jiangsu, they built up the ship factory. It's built up the ships. And this one is that time when all of these things have a very high cost. They cannot pay, they cannot have a return. And then the 1960s, the economic crisis happened. And also from 1960s, Soviet Union retreat, gave 0 to China, and also take all the advisor people, these are professors, technicians, managers, all send them back to Soviet Union, not sent from China side, it's ordered from Soviet Union. They retreat all the technical support, all the financial support, whatever. So from 1960, China got to have delinking again. So from 1950, relinking with foreign capital from Soviet Union, and the whole of the system is Soviet Unionized or SSSRized. And then they are trying to maintain their sovereignty since 1955. And then the contradiction happened, quarreling, arguments between these two countries. But if you go back to the first page, when we talk about geostrategy, you can see that US succeeded to recontrol the Europe, West Europe, and Japan, I mean East Asia. Originally, China is a made area, not belong to Soviet Union, not belong to United States. Soviet Union, caused by the Korean War, Soviet Union recontrolled China in 1950s, but only 5 years. From 1955, China trying to maintain their sovereignty, and then the quarreling happened, and then finally, 5 years later in 1960, Soviet Union gave up. That is a potential events of Soviet Union collapse. That is why, when in the 21st century, people talk about Soviet Union and China strategic relations, a lot of people will give such kind of historical lessons to say that China, Soviet Union, or China, Russia cannot set up any strong ally. And it's because they have done something in 1950s, but broken in late 1950. But the big cost taken by China is an economic crisis. That is a very popular. That is a universal universal value. We need to notice that is the regulation. When you take foreign capital, you can have a development, but this all turn to the debts, potentially or obviously. In the first 5 years, it's potentially. But when the political relation, I mean geopolitical relation break, all the debts, all the foreign aim turn to the foreign debts. And then foreign debts means that you have no further investments ability. And then you must have the economic crisis. And the Central try their best to maintain Soviet Union styles heavy industry and the military industry. But that is a big cost, because heavy industrial products cannot be immediately taken by people's life. It's not for people's life, it's for the war. So the heavy industrial, military industrial put together, is that time 70% of the Chinese industrial structure. It means that 70% could hardly be used by the people's life, by the common society. So you want to maintain such kind of 70% of heavy industry, military industries, you need to pay more cost. That is why from 1960s, China became a kind of poor country. All people have a very little consumption. You need to give more surplus to the governments to maintain such kind of industry. That's very special style industry. Also, that time from 1960, the environment, political environment, became more and more tensioned. You should know that it's from 1960s, Chinese Taiwan, controlled by KMD, at time want to reoccupy the mainland China, facilitated by United States. And then United States also from 1960s sends at least 800 times Air Force to fly inside. And that means that it's not in war, but that is a kind of assault. And then China-Indian border fightings. And then there's just haven't finished. There's a Southeast China Peninsula. Southeast China Peninsula is also the regional war. joined not only originally by Europe and then finally taken by the United States directly. And so from 1960, when China regained the independence, delinking again, the whole of the environment became more and more tension. So make China have to maintain such kind of heavy industry and military industry because you need to prepare for the fightings. So that is why since 1960s, the whole people became soldiers. Maoism at that time became more and more popular, easier to mobilize people to join the collective system, to join the state system, and then for the protection, for the protection of your sovereignty. So that is 1960s. That is caused by the crisis. So it also means that China always make a kind of very logical thinking about the crisis, because crisis changed into Chinese words. That is two meaning. One is danger, another is opportunity. The Chinese logic never thinks something is only one thing. They make different things together in one word. So 危机 means danger and opportunity. So China take this danger, notice the cost, and then take also the opportunity, trying to set up another strategy. That is self-reliance, struggle hard, 艰苦奋斗，自力更生，艰苦奋斗. That is Maoism became a kind of more and more popular in all the third world countries, means new developing countries. That's because only that's one. Stand in the earth by their own legs, feet, use their own efforts to maintain their country's sovereignty. So that is 1960s. We do have a lot of difficulties because that the physical system almost bankrupted, and there's no any ability to keep investments into the industries. So large number of the workers lay off, and maintain their position. The workers maintain position less than the workers lay off. So means that more than half of workers lay off, and also the young people got to send to the countryside. At that time, if there's no collective system, it's more than 10 million unemployment young people from urban area sent to the countryside. It's almost no food. But by the rural take this large number of the young unemployment people, feed them, and buy their own food. So means that hunger became more and more popular in the whole of the rural society. In urban society, the few people die in hunger, but in the rural area, many people die in hunger. And so it's a very obviously case to show that how urban industry transfer out the cost to the countryside. The urban transfer out the cost to the people because urban is a capital intensive area. Rural is a population intensive or labor intensive area. So that's a dual system. Let's go to next. And caused by these contradictions, these problems inside of Chinese political leaders, there is still have a lot of different ideas to give the explanation. Some people may think that it's a Mao make mistake. Some people will think that it's made this mistake come from rethinking, from dependence. As you too much depends on Soviet Union. So there is a kind of contradiction inside of China. It's not very obviously, but it still be there. And so there's a Mao and the Liu. So and also that there is some kind of beneficiary groups, cannot be exactly interest group because that time the political power still be worked. So and they cannot exactly to take this interest by themselves. but they can benefit the whole of the participants. And so that means, and some area like Shanghai is a kind of beneficiary area. Some group like the military industries, they are a kind of beneficiary groups, but they cannot exactly be the interest group. And so we have such kind of explanation trying to make a difference with the later. We did have interest group after 1980s, especially in 1990s. That is a later reform. We gave them the legal position to be the interest group, and then they became interest group. But before that, they can benefit by their job or their field or their area, but not exactly taken by individual, by family. This means that all area, like Shanghai, all of these areas are benefited by such kind of system. So that is why none of any Shanghai citizen would like to leave Shanghai. If they leave, they all want to come back. So that is, even they have just a 1 square meters place, they want to stay in Shanghai because they can benefit a lot. That is a beneficial area, like Beijing also. So, and when Mao and Liu, they have different ideas. Mao want Deng come to the center to make some balance. But Deng is very fast turn to the Liu and not for working for Mao. So there are so many internal contradictions happen that time. So we don't need to give more detailed explanations because we also have no documents. So we only can say that what is the regulation, what is the rule. So we said all of these are, all of the developing countries did have pro-capital policy because of the capital shortage. If you want to set up modernization. Modernization means industrialization and urbanization. All need capital intensive. If you have a zero capital, you need to trade with your independence, trade with your natural resources or labor resources or whatever. So even in Mao's time, when you got to pay back all the debts, you also need to turn to the capital. You need to maintain your capital, especially industrial capitals. So any ism, any ideology, practically speaking, the governments set up the pro-capital policy is a popular phenomenon. That is finally we gave the conclusion. And when we trying to give summarize the summary of the experience, we have to say that since 1960s, we have a big hunger. After that, China have a long history, almost half century, we have no hunger again. Why? It's because the hunger caused by foreign capital turned to the government's physical debts. At that time, let's go back to this one. This time, you can see that this one means that the government's investments into the economic growth down to minus 45 or 50 means that the capital is a minus. Why that I said that all the governments set up the policy pro-capital? Because if you have this one, means that all the people suffered. No job, no employment, no income, no revenue. So that is bad enough. And then here is also the so-called the surplus of the physical system also down to the bottom. Broke the bottom. down to the 50%. So that's 1960s. And so-called that's when it's GDP down to the minus 20s. So then the second Chinese crisis is in the history, in the whole of the new China's history, is the worst. Others not so worst. That's why it's a worse, but not so worst. Not so worse. It's a worst, this one. So and then that's caused by the foreign investments retreat. So you got to set up a new strategy. It's a self-reliance by the people's commune, by collective system. So when we talk about this conclusion, we are trying to give the summary. We got to say that if you want to solve the problem, you first need to pay attention to the foreign capital. Foreign capital can play a very important role, also can play a very bad role. So then we need to know that the traditional agriculture is very important for your stabilize your situation. When the 1960 serious crisis happened, the Chinese authority made the decision to give a part of the traditional agricultural benefits to the households. Since 1961, every household can have 15% of the land from the collective system. Collective system can help you to stand the economic crisis. But when crisis happened, you need to give back some priorities to the households. So that time they have a so-called 自留地, means that households may reserved agricultural land. The agricultural land, and also they can have some little bit wasteland and pieces. But the total amount of this self-reserved land is less than 15%, or less 15 to 20%, means that people can use at least 20% or 15% to 20% land to do the agriculture for the family survive. That is quite important. And also that for these products from these 20% of land, they reopen the village market. So every village, 5 days, you can turn to one opportunity to open your village market. And other villagers can come to your markets to buy and sell. So it means that it gave a little bit room for the rural society. They can go back to the traditional way. So when we talk about the first crisis in China, we said that the land reform is a traditional system. Every new dynasty needs to give peasants equal rights to have a tailored rights. So I said the traditional save the crisis. The tradition system solved the problem of the 1930s KMT government's modernized crisis. Solved the problems by tradition. Modernization created the big problem, big crisis, solved by go back to tradition. Remember that. So this time, when we talk about 1960s, the new authority, new governments also created big crisis caused by foreign capital retreat. That's also very big crisis. This time also need to have some traditional way as a measures to deal with the industrial capital crisis. That is allow people retreat a little bit, 15% to 20%, back to the traditional way, not in collective. And then when these people do have some food for their family survive. So the crisis, the severe of the crisis decreased or downgrade. That is a very interesting logic. Most of West-centric philosophy cannot understand. You 2 times. The first time you use the tradition to solve the problem of modernization. Second time in 1960s. 1950s you do it. 1960s you second have the same effect. Use the traditional agricultural way to solve the foreign capital crisis. That is the rural. That is a base. It's a comprehensive base for make the urban crisis soft landing. This time it's not exact soft landing because it transfer too much cost to the rural. So rural, many people died. So that is why we need to talking about the positive externalities of agricultural society in the traditional system. Until now, the rural society, if you destroy the rural society, your crisis will have nowhere to soft landing. So that is our conclusion. And finally, when we turn to these so-called modern concept, we need to give some explanation about the modern concept. What is a development? Development means that you make the resources capitalization and take the added value by the capitalist or by the capital owner or by the investors, anyway, by the capital. So development means that capital to capitalize the natural resources and the human resources, take the interest back to the capital. That is a development. And then when we talk about institution, the institution means that when you want to run into the modernization, Western styles, you need to, based on your natural resources structure, and then put these resources into the productivity. When this procedure happened, your structure of the productivity create the institution. Means that institution following taking place from your modernization, from the procedure of your modernization. And so the natural resources capitalization make the resources become the productivity. And then you set up the structure. You created a lot of the cost, and then you take the returns and have the distribution mechanism. So all of these factors turn together to be the institutions. So that is our explanation about institution. Now we have an institutional transition. Institutional transition means that the institutional cost turn to whom? Mean who take the cost, who take the return. That is the key issue of the institutional transition. So when you have such kind of cost transfer and return taking, that make the transition path dependence. So that is when we talk about the path dependence, we also know that is that the path dependence turn back to constrain the institutional transition. So many different ideas with the textbook of Western economics. Western economists, they have a institutional economics. We have a different explanation of Western economics and Western institutional economics. We are trying to have some theoretical craze. So then this one is more clear. When we talk about 1950s in China, what happened? The mainly happened is a primitive accumulation for industrialization. So we talk a lot about primitive accumulation. We said none of any industrialization can avoid such kind of historical period. But primitive accumulation can be carried out by the governments. In Western countries, they said it's taken by the private sector, but it's not true. Think about what is the East Indian Company. It's private? No, it's government. East Indian Company, originally it's Dutch, and then UK. All are state form and combining by the state army. So they are trying to wash out whatever they did and then tell you that liberalism is a free market system. It's not true. When they taken the resources for the capitalization, they use the state form. They use it's a state-owned enterprise. So that is mainly by the governments. And then turn to the government's corporationism or government corporatism. Government corporatism means that government's a corporation. Government's not the governments. So, and especially this later industrialized country, when they want to accelerate the primitive accumulation, they got to use the governments to replace the private departments. And now only one thing left for the people, that is social resources. Nowadays, a lot of social movements based on the social resources to do the social resources as a social capitalization. And there's a lot of problems need to pay attention to, because that these social capitalization also have a lot of interest group. So when we are all under the capitalist system, a lot of events influenced or impacted by the capital, even the social resources. And just now when we talk about the rich and the poor, we said the rich poor in China performed as a poor countryside, rich urban. As there's a Russian novel writer, Tolstoy. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Tolstoy. Tolstoy. He said the happiness family is the same. The unhappiness family is different. Yes? It's not standard translation, not good translation, but the meaning is clear. We said the advanced developed country is the same, but this advanced poor country is different. So we found that different poor country have different conditions. But one thing is quite important, means that the more modernized political superstructure in developing country, the more cost. That is the more. And the more close to Western system developing country, the more poor. We can not give you the example, but that is not so good for these countries. But that is a regulation. So when we talk about the second crisis in China, we must give you the key issue that in 1950s, the second crisis in China mainly caused by the foreign capital turn to the foreign debts. And especially this foreign capital mainly invested in the heavy industries. And the heavy industries not applied to the local markets. So that means your cost, the instead cost, maybe double, maybe three or four, even more times. and then the cost will be more severe. So this cost cannot be taken by the beneficiary area or beneficiary group, only can transfer out to the countryside. That is the 1960s big hunger's main reason. Okay, so we can not give the whole picture, but very roughly, we draw up a picture as a kind of explanation what 1950s. There are so many events need to have a more detailed explanation. So we hope that people would like to join the studies in the 1950s history. Okay, thank you. I finished.